Good morning. The meeting of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission will come to order. For those of you who have watched over the past 2 days, we have been examining the issues of subprime lending and securitization and how they might have affected the financial crisis and contributed to the financial crisis that has gripped our country. Today, we will be examining what occurred at Fannie Mae and its regulator, OFEO, the Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight, and its successor agency, the FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency. This morning, we will be hearing from Mr. Daniel Mudd and Mr. Robert Levin, who were with Fannie Mae. And so thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this morning. I'm going to start off by asking you to do what we have customarily done with all witnesses to date, and we will do with all witnesses from here on forward, and that is to ask you both to stand so I can administer the oath to you. Do you solemnly swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you are about to provide the Commission will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to the best of your knowledge? Thank you very, very much. Now, we are going to start this morning by asking each of you to give a oral opening statement. We have your testimony in hand, and we thank you for that. We'd like you each to take no more than 10 minutes for your oral statement. And Mr. Levin, we're going to start with you today, and so we're ready for your testimony. Before I start, though, Mr. Vice Chairman, would you like to make any opening remarks this morning?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I would take the opportunity, as is usual with me, to ask you that if over the rest of the Commission's existence we have reason to continue a discussion over the material that you presented, would you be willing to respond to written questions in a timely fashion in an ongoing way? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Mr. Levin, proceed. Oh, and by the way, one last item. You will see a light in front of you, and when it gets to 1 minute, if you see these little lights on the table, it will move to yellow with 1 minute to go and red when time is up.
And that means it's liftoff. Mr. Levin, if you would move the mic a little closer. They're very sensitive and directional. Is the light on the mic?
Is the light on the mic?
Yeah, it just needs to be a little closer.
Good. We'll start your time over, good sir.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's now
good. Now, yes, I was.
Sounds better.
It sounded like a very weak mic. All right.
It's now a bright. It's now a brighter.
Let's start over. Good morning, Mr. Levin.
Yes, thank you.
Let's go ahead and start over, and let's go.
Okay. Start over from scratch, sir? Okay. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and distinguished commissioners, thank you for providing me the opportunity to appear before you today to assist the Commission in examining the causes of the financial crisis. As you know, I submitted to the Commission a written statement in advance of the hearing, and I will not repeat the more detailed explanation, but I thought I would highlight a few of my thoughts now. I am happy to provide whatever assistance I can and will do my best to answer all of your questions to the best of my ability. I was at Fannie Mae for 27 years until my retirement in August 2008. And while I left Fannie Mae prior to the takeover and the imposition of conservatorship, I continued to work as an advisor to senior management for about 6 months at the request of the new CEO. At Fannie Mae, I was privileged to work with many fine individuals and organizations, including mortgage lenders, community groups, housing organizations, and other stakeholders, to help Americans achieve the dream of homeownership and affordable rental housing. My pride at the contributions of Fannie Mae has understandably been overshadowed by the events that give rise to this hearing. From my perspective, Fannie Mae was engulfed by an unprecedented decline in home prices and resulting dislocations in the housing markets, and these were truly catastrophic. While some people foresaw a correction, few, if any, predicted the unusually rapid and devastating destruction of real estate values that occurred. In hindsight, if we and the industry as a whole had been able to anticipate the nature and extent of the crisis that engulfed the market, it is clear that we all would have conducted our business differently during this period. But we, like everyone else, were surprised by the unprecedented extent of the economic crisis. However, Fannie Mae, unlike other financial institutions, was restricted to one class of assets because of the charter, and thus we took the brunt of the crisis head on. At the same time, the global economy was in the middle of a liquidity and credit crisis that damaged the capital markets. Shortly thereafter, unemployment rose. This extraordinary upheaval in the economy and in the mortgage market in particular challenged Fannie Mae in ways that would have been difficult to overcome regardless of any business decisions that preceded the crisis. As the Commission is aware, Congress created Fannie Mae as a government-sponsored enterprise, and as such we had a variety of important stakeholders, which included the Congress, our mission and safety and soundness regulators, private shareholders, debt and MBS investors, mortgage lenders, housing organizations, and others. As a private company, Fannie Mae raised capital from investors and sought to provide them with a competitive rate of return. As a company with a public purpose, Fannie Mae sought to ensure the liquidity of the mortgage market, its only permissible line of business, and to promote affordable housing, which also included meeting government-mandated housing goals. The housing goals were set forth in Fannie Mae's Charter Act. Some of the goals related to our single-family business, some related to multifamily. In general, certain goals required that a specified percentage of our business be for families at lower income levels, and other goals required that a specified percentage of our business be located in certain places in the country that were considered underserved. HUD increased these goals from time to time, frequently requiring levels of affordable housing and underserved market business that were higher than what our market naturally produced. In response, the company engaged in efforts to create business to help us meet the goals. These efforts included outreach programs and the application of different underwriting and pricing standards. Part of Fannie Mae's business in the secondary mortgage market was to purchase and securitize mortgage loans created by lenders. Fannie Mae's influence on the type of loans that lenders originated often changed depending upon market conditions and the availability of alternative sources of capital for lenders. When Fannie Mae was one of the principal sources of capital in the mortgage market, Fannie Mae's influence was greater. When other sources of capital were more plentiful, as in the period prior to the crisis, Fannie Mae's influence was diminished. Fannie Mae and the other GSEs were unique. We took our duties to our shareholders and our public missions very seriously. Throughout most of my 27 years at Fannie Mae, the company was able to balance successfully its potentially conflicting objectives. However, this was more difficult when the markets experienced significant change and during periods of great stress in the system. The growth in the last decade of the private label mortgage-backed securities market is one such change that had a significant impact on the mortgage markets and Fannie Mae. Private label securities, or PLS for short, are mortgage-backed securities issued by entities other than Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae. PLS finance three main types of mortgage products: subprime mortgages, alt-A mortgages, and jumbo loans. In 2003, which was also a year of heavy refinance activity, The size of the PLS market was about half of the size of Fannie Mae's security issuances. In 2004, that changed dramatically. The PLS market increased and Fannie Mae decreased. Dollar volumes of PLS exceeded that of Fannie Mae MBS and almost reached the levels of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac combined. In 2005 and in early 2006, that trend continued, with the dollar volume of PLS issued exceeding the MBS issued by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae combined. The effects of PLS on Fannie Mae's business were significant. Our business activity relative to the overall market declined dramatically during this period of time. Secondly, many of the new products funded by PLS had features that attracted low-income borrowers, which threatened our ability to meet our mandated housing goals. Fannie Mae had never previously experienced market changes of the magnitude that we were seeing during this period. There was an article in 2006 in a publication called Mortgage Banking, which I quote in my written statement, which summarized the significance of these trends. And to briefly quote it here, quote, "A change in the mortgage-backed securities market that began more than 2 years ago appears to have completely reshuffled the industry's deck of cards. Now issuers of PLS are holding the aces that were once held by the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Once a junior but powerful player in the market, PLS are now the leading force driving product innovation and net overall volume of mortgage origination. Further, it appears that the new dominant role for private securities may be here to stay." Unquote. The PLS phenomenon and the resulting consequences for our business confronted Fannie Mae with critical strategic questions. First, were the changes temporary or were they permanent? And second, would we best be able to deliver competitive returns to shareholders, stay relevant to customers, and meet our mission requirements by doing nothing new or by increasing our participation in these markets to some degree? These and related questions were the subject of continuous and serious discussion and in-depth analysis by the Fannie Mae management team and the board of directors over the last decade. We addressed these issues in a series of dedicated strategic planning sessions as well as day-to-day discussions. We considered the credit risks in the new markets, our capabilities to manage the business, and the impact on our achievement of housing goals, our financial results, and our strategic positioning in the marketplace. These considerations led management to expand Fannie Mae's already existing Alt-A business incrementally over time. In implementing these decisions, management continued to mitigate risk by applying underwriting standards that were more conservative than the standards prevalent in the market at the time. Although Fannie Mae's Alt-A books sustained disproportionate losses, it did perform better than the market and sustained smaller losses than otherwise might have occurred. Our involvement in the subprime market was minimal. It primarily consisted of the purchase of the AAA-rated private label securities secured by subprime loans, and these purchases contributed greatly to housing goal objectives. With the benefit of hindsight, had we anticipated the extraordinary market meltdown, we would have been far less likely to expand our involvement in these non-traditional products. We began to reduce our participation in the Alt-A market in 2007 as the market and our business took a turn for the worse. We tried to balance the pace of our withdrawal with our public mission to provide liquidity, a critical function as the PLS market had dried up.
Can you wrap up, Mr. Levin, please? Thank you.
Yes, sir. In closing, an unprecedented decline in home prices, a high unemployment rate, a global liquidity and credit crisis engulfed Fannie Mae and its only line of business, the secondary market for mortgages. These crises were centered on our market and our asset class, and we took the full brunt of the market crisis head on, which would have been difficult for the company to deal with under any circumstances. Thank you. I'm pleased to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mudd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman. I've had the opportunity to watch some of the Commission's proceedings this week, and having submitted remarks which cover a broad array of topics, I'm going to try a little bit to tailor my remarks to some of the issues that you've been pursuing. And thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I joined Fannie Mae as the Chief Operating Officer in 2000, following a decade at GE. In December of 2004, I served as Interim Chief Executive Officer, and in June of 2005, the Board of Directors, with the approval of our regulator, named me the CEO. During my time at Fannie Mae, the company and the U.S. housing markets faced many challenges. During the early part of my tenure, I worked to reinvent the company and move forward with a sense of purpose and value and humility. I worked to improve the relationship between Fannie Mae and its regulator, the former FAO, and to return Fannie Mae to timely filing status with the SEC. After the completion of that, one of the most complicated restatements in recent history, the company emerged to face the housing depression and the financial crisis, and it did not survive. I want to be clear, I was the CEO of the company, and I accept responsibility for everything that happened on my watch. Over the past couple of days, I've heard Mr. Greenspan assign himself a 70-30 rating, and I believe the chairman gave himself a 51-49 rating. I am envious. My experience was that during the crisis of 2007 and 2008, at the GSEs, it was virtually impossible to get on the positive side of that ratio because so many decisions were a choice between unsavory alternatives. Certainly, Fannie Mae endeavored to be best in class and to continuously improve our business. We hired talented executives to build world-class risk management, modeling capabilities, maintain strong controls, and comply with regulations. I did the best that I knew how to consider alternatives, to develop processes, to listen to critical voices, and ultimately to try to predict the perilous path of the housing market. I could not do what a private firm could do: leave the market, close the window, or short mortgages. The GSEs had to stay in the market, provide liquidity, and obviously were structured to be long-only mortgages. The GSE structure required the companies to maintain a fine balance between financial goals and what we called mission goals. On one hand, without revenue and profits and growth, the company could not attract global capital to the U.S. housing market. And on the other hand, without meeting the mission goals for affordable housing and liquidity, the GSEs could not meet the requirements of their congressional charter. Thus, I agree with former Treasury Secretary Paulson's ultimate assessment that the root cause of the GSE's troubles lies with their business model. A monoline GSE asked to perform multiple tasks cannot withstand a multi-year 30% home price decline on a national scale, even had it been without the accompanying global financial turmoil. The government-sponsored enterprises were able to balance business and mission when home prices were rising. They could perform when home prices were flat. They could survive a 30-year flood, but not 2008. As you know, the GSEs acquire mortgages in the secondary market to promote liquidity, stability, and affordable housing for the American people. The congressionally created GSE businesses were specifically prohibited by law from participating in any business outside the secondary market for mortgages in the United States. Unlike other financial institutions, this left the GSEs unable to diversify and therefore to avoid losses stemming from any U.S. housing finance crisis. And 2007 to 2010 was not merely a housing crisis. We've witnessed a market collapse, a collapse of the only market that the GSEs were in. Starting in 2007, the financial sector grappled with what most observers view as the worst conditions ever seen in the modern capital markets. In the midst of turmoil, virtually every other housing sector investor fled the market, and the GSEs were specifically required to take up the slack. Through the spring and summer of 2008, my colleagues and I worked with government officials, regulators, our customers in the banking system, housing advocates, and others to maintain the excruciating balance between providing the liquidity to keep the market functioning and protecting Fannie Mae's regulatory capital. Until the time the government imposed conservatorship, FAO stated that Fannie Mae had maintained capital in accord with the relevant regulatory standards, and we were still, along with Freddie Mac, the principal source of lending to the mortgage market. Based on ongoing examinations and frequent, if not daily, meetings into late August 2008, our regulator continued to declare us in full compliance with our capital requirements. We were also balancing against our HUD housing goals, our role in the global capital markets, our fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders, and critically, the need to help individual homeowners afford their mortgages, stay in their homes, and avoid unnecessary foreclosures. And we sought this balance consistent with a very strict interpretation of our congressional charter. As the crisis became havoc, Fannie Mae was called upon by the administration to refinance subprime borrowers who could qualify for a fixed-rate loan. The GSEs were asked to provide the lead in providing modifications. They were asked to provide warehouse loans by lenders who had previously resisted the idea of Fannie or Freddie entering that market. From other corners, Fannie and Freddie were variously pushed to raise capital, earn returns, rescue more borrowers, and cut costs. I sought to balance the fine points of mission and business insofar as I could understand them with the support of regulators and policymakers. That was no longer possible by September 6, 2008, and I am sorry for that. Since that time, as all agree, the companies have been operated to implement public policy. As I've tried to explain, a considerable portion of my energies went into balancing the increasingly conflicting demands of operating an enterprise sponsored by the government. That notion of balance is now a thing of the past. Shortly after conservatorship, the regulator declared both the housing goals and the capital standards invalid. I believe, in retrospect, that there was overinvestment in housing. I believe, in retrospect, origination standards slipped. There was too much intermediation. There were too many middlemen. Home ownership rates probably rose too high. The GSEs were chartered to expand and increase home ownership while operating as private companies. In doing so, they contributed to the crisis, but they did not precipitate it. Let me end by suggesting that home ownership remains a central dream for many Americans. I believe that once this crisis is behind us, the fundamental and solid economics of home ownership will reassert themselves. And I hope in that there's an opportunity to engage in the future structure of the housing finance system. There was a lasting consensus in this country, really going all the way back to the Great Depression, that home ownership was a net good for individuals, for communities, and for the country at large. Absent some new consensus, I fear it will be difficult to choose between competing models for a new housing finance system. Government entities created to support home ownership as a social good will tend to socialize the risk to all taxpayers. Purely private companies will exercise their fiduciary responsibility to pass the costs and the risks to homeowners. Hybrid organizations such as a GSE will be left to balance conflicts between taxpayers and homeowners and shareholders. There are no simple answers. I appreciate the Commission's work to understand the causes of the crisis, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mudd and Mr. Levin. We will now proceed to questioning by commissioners. I will start with some questions today before we move on, and so let me just move into this. So really to either one of you or both of you, in each of these questions I'm going to put some facts on the table for the public and for you. According to your SEC reports, the 2009 Form 10-Ks, Fannie Mae reported about $134 billion of net losses in 2008 and 2009, most of which were driven by credit-related expenses, loan losses, which totaled more than $104 billion, in credit losses, which totaled more than $40 billion. If you look at the losses, very significantly, they come from loans with higher risk product features, Alt-A, subprime, interest only, loan-to-value of 90% plus, loans with FICO scores of less than 620 that were originated in 2006 and 2007. At the heart of it, looking back on that business decision, would you kind of go to the thinking behind your thinking behind, as leaders of this organization, really the dramatic expansion in these higher risk products in that 2006-07 period? What was at the core of the decision to move more dramatically into that arena? And just for the edification of you and others, I guess, as you look at losses, for example, in losses in 07, all loans, the selected higher risk product features constitute, I believe, 29% of the loans, but 58% of the losses. In 08, 28% of the loans, 75% of the losses. In 2009, 24% of the loans and 69% of the losses.
Mr. Chairman, certainly the higher risk loans put on the books closer to the time that the underlying home market collapsed were the worst performing and were the first to go. So if you could go back retrospectively and look across the book of loans, I think anybody could say that in particular the Alt-A book is, as you pointed out in your data, a source of the difficulty. The thinking goes back over a period of time, and just as a bit of context, the company had come out of a period where through the 90s, Fannie Mae was really the dominant force in the marketplace, and during the period of the restatement, that had slipped on one hand, and on the other hand, the market had developed a number of ways to go around. An A mortgage was a Fannie Mae mortgage, and an Alt-A mortgage stood for nothing more than an alternative to an A mortgage and an alternative to a Fannie Mae mortgage. So there were a number of studies, questions, process to look at the market and to determine whether the features that went with Alt-A mortgages were things that we had been asking for 10 or 15 or 20 years that were no longer relevant to the market. Oh yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Or whether they were key data that were still needed. What were the variances between the A market and the Alt-A market, and so forth. And overriding that, a broad concern that under the continuation of these trends, Fannie Mae and by derivation Freddie Mac's role in the market would be less relevant. So there was a sort of a strategic question of relevance that went to that, led us to use the data that we had to study the market and develop a plan to understand it, go in prudently, buy some securities, get the data, look at the data, develop some experts that understood how the market operated, look at the originators, do business with those we knew, and we built it out from there. It was a reflection of the growth that Mr. Levin described in his statement of that whole segment of the market, that portion of the book grew. It grew along with the market.
Well, and let me ask very specifically, your market share in 2002 was, of the mortgage market, about 29.4%, 2003, 36%, 2004, 24.8%, 2005, 19.6%. Was this, and I don't want to tilt it, I want to ask of the things you laid out in terms of your considerations, was it market share, competitive positioning that drove you, or mission-related items that drove you?
Well, it was.
And I'd actually like to ask you, and you also, Mr. Levin.
I would say it was a combination of those things, but I would say that we did not consider market share itself to be a primary output, right? So market share to me is kind of a secondary indicator of do you have a role in the market? Are you remaining relevant to the market? I mean, it's really a very direct.
So if that's secondary, what's primary?
Primary is the mission component in the business. So are we performing our mission? Are we in the markets that we're supposed to be in? Is homeownership growing on one hand? And on the other hand, are we maintaining capital? Are we earning a fair return for our investments? Are we managing the financial side of it?
Okay, and I'm asking you to weigh these. So you're really saying market share is not the driver unto itself, but then let me take the two mission related. And to be clear, you're not necessarily talking about public policy related, but it could include that. You're talking about your corporate mission writ large. And you are saying, obviously, return on equity to shareholders, profitability, growth, and then home ownership mission. How would you weigh those?
I always try to weigh them about equally over the course of time. Obviously, on any given decision, you could move one thing up or one thing down.
All right, Mr. Levin? Can you pull that?
Yeah, sorry.
Mic
Yeah,
on and close.
I'll get better as we go along. I would repeat, I think, the items that Mr. Mudd said. I think the major macro driver was this growth in the private label securities market, which ultimately became larger in issuances than Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae combined. And that was the main cause behind the numbers that you went over about our share of the market.
So competition from Wall Street, bluntly stated.
That impacted our market position
Right.
Dramatically. Also dramatically impacted our ability to influence what was going on in the market because of the competition. And it posed a number of threats to the company. And it posed a financial threat because there was just simply less business that was coming into our market. The business was going into another market. It posed a mission threat because many of the products that were financed by PLS had affordability features, and so it threatened our ability to meet our government-mandated housing goals. It also threatened our relevance with our customers, and I recall a customer saying, to the degree I'm doing less business with you, why should I invest in my own company resources to continue to do more?
And that person would be?
That was a conversation actually on the multifamily side.
Oh, okay.
Which was also affected by the same
All right.
same influence, but same influence. I just happen to recall that conversation. And then overall there was just the strategic positioning in the marketplace. And so those were the strategic issues that we were confronting and that we were trying to deal with, along with associated issues of to what degree was this phenomenon permanent, to what degree was it temporary, could we really sit out, would we be permitted to sit out? That's what we were grappling with.
All right, let me see if I can quickly move to some other questions here. Not unlike some others, you pursued a highly leveraged growth strategy. Your assets went from about your total assets plus off-balance sheet guaranteed mortgage-backed securities went from about $1.4 trillion in 2000 to $3.2 trillion. Your capital ratio is about 1.5%, so that's about a leverage ratio. If my math training does me well, probably on the order of, I got it here actually. Your leverage ratio was generally either anywhere from 62 to 1 to up to 73 to 1. Now, you weren't alone. I mean, during the same period when, you're more than doubling your assets, Goldman Sachs is almost tripling them, JP Morgan's almost doubling them. But, on reflection, your capital held was extraordinarily low, 2.5% of capital against on-balance assets, just 0.45% or 45 basis points on your off-balance sheet. And if you look at some of the numbers that when we look at our investigation of all your data, it showed that the level of loans with higher risk product features were many times the level of Fannie's reported capital. For example, Alt-A loans alone were 583% of capital in 2006, 644% of capital in 2007. I just have to ask you, and this is not a question I'll just say, but what were you guys thinking just in terms of that extraordinary level of leverage, where you're 62 to 1, you're 72 to 1, so that any kind of market bump is going to shake your company to its very foundations, if not collapse it?
It's a terrific and fundamental question, Mr. Chairman. My interpretation is that by virtue of the GSEs being put into business as private companies with a public mission, the private company component of it, in order for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to attract global capital and put it to work in the U.S. housing market, we had to be able to provide a competitive return on that capital, e.g. competitive with other financial institutions. Other financial institutions during the period of my memory, probably in the 15, 18, 20% range of return on equity. Our return probably one notch below that in the 15 to 17% range of return on equity. So in some sense, the capital, which was statutory on the government side, became the capital to do business on the business side of the equation.
But that was the minimum capital statutorily. You could have been above that.
And we were above the minimum capital. There was a regulatory override. We were above the regulatory override, and in fact had raised capital all through 2007 and 2008, so that actually at the end of my time at the company, we had more capital than we'd had at any point in the company's recent history.
All right, let me ask you a couple of other questions here in way of framework. There were a number of documents we looked at. July 19, 2005 board meeting where Citi and McKinsey, who I guess were financial advisors to you, basically stated that staying the course was not an option. In other words, that you did have to move into the non-traditional market more dramatically. There was a February 21st board meeting where I believe you presented the plan that said we need to reverse market share by increasing market share of mortgage-backed securities from 23% to at least 25%. There's a July 18th board meeting in which you talk about why you need to ramp up again because of this issue of market share relevance. There was one other report, though. June 2005 at a company retreat, Mr. Lund made a presentation called Single Family Guarantee, Facing Strategic Crossroads, in which at least he indicated to us that he recommended staying the course. And I guess, had you taken that more conservative, looking back on it, would it have been wiser to maintain your underwriting standards, stay on the existing market course, or would you have still been swept under by the size of the wave?
If I can give you a three-part answer, on the last part, the analysis that I've done suggests if you presume that Fannie Mae would need to remain a AAA company to do the business that it was in, and you presume that in order to maintain a AAA rating, the agencies usually require no more than 30% preferred capital. And if you used every dollar of the maximum net income that the company ever earned, about $6 billion, and put it to servicing additional capital, the maximum theoretical capital that the company could have raised would have been about $90 billion. And that wouldn't have been enough under any circumstances.
Would not have been.
To my knowledge. That's the first part. The second part, Mr. Lund's presentation, we actually did follow his advice, and his advice was we didn't think of it as a black and white choice. Do you do the 30-year fully amortizing fixed rate loans only, or do you do only the other stuff? The question was how far do you want to move to make sure that the market's not going to shift away from me permanently? So his suggestion, as I recall it, was let's stick to our knitting. Let's emphasize the product that, after all, is our bread and butter, that 30-year loan. But we also need to understand these other markets and have controlled, managed, high process-intensive participation in the markets. And then the third point is actually separated from that, not really part of that analysis, was the McKinsey Citi work, which was really to assess whether, in the context of thinking about the business model that we've talked about probably enough today, was another business model appropriate? In other words, should we turn in the charter and privatize the company and thereby restructure through some of these challenges that we faced?
And let me, Citigroup was in as a financial advisor to you in this capacity, correct?
Yes, but I don't want to miss answers.
No, I just was clear.
It was what?
It was, yeah. They were advising, correct?
They were advising us, and they and McKinsey were more or less engaged under the same terms to do the same work, but to do it independently so that there wouldn't be groupthink, if you will.
All right, here's my last question for both of you, and then I want to move on to other members. The memo recommending conservatorship, which was, I think, September 6th, correct, from FHFA. It's a pretty damning document in terms of its assessment of Fannie. And I'm just, it refers to members of the executive management team made imprudent decisions. Many of the decisions were unsafe and unsound. They go on to talk about, despite clear signs in the latter half of 2006 and 2007 of growing problems in the economy, management continued activity in riskier programs and maintained its higher eligibility program for Alt-A loans. I'm just going to ask you to comment on whether you agreed or not with the assessment of the conservators' report. And both of you, just as briefly as you can, and I may ask you for more on the record in this in terms of writing so I don't consume all the time here.
I had announced my retirement. I never saw that document at that time.
Thank you.
I did not agree. And if I can just back up for a short period of time, throughout the spring, summer, and fall of 2008, we were engaged in a really broad array of wide-ranging, good faith discussions with both AFEO. And my first visit when I became the CEO was to get in a car and go downtown and see the then director. The first thing I did when the new director came in was gave him a security badge that had all of the same door openers that mine had. There were examiners on site. We were having conversations every single day. And like with any examination routine, there are issues that are identified, could be self-identified, could be identified by the regulator. You put a project and a process and a budget and some people around them, and you work your way through them. That's happening all the time. In this day and age, no examiners are going to sit there and say, we're not paying attention to anything. So those conversations continued all the way through the date of that letter. And when I received it, I had to believe that it had been stuck up in the mail somewhere, and it was something from so far in the past, because the issues were known in the process of remediating. Many of them had already been remediated. They had all been identified to the regulator. So I think it simply goes to the context that the purpose of the letter was really to force conservatorship.
All right. I may ask for more in terms of written. I'll stop my questioning now and go to the Vice Chairman. Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to hold my questions to the end because there are commissioners who have not only a very great interest in this area, I do as well, but they have spent not just the time of this commission, but years examining these institutions and the circumstances surrounding them as you have been asking questions, Mr. Chairman. So I'll defer my questions till the end and let those folks carry the questioning for now.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Ms. Murrin.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. I'd like to follow the discussion from earlier about corporate goals and individual professional goals, and specifically looking at the way that you determine those particular goals. And I also refer back to some of the documents that we've had an opportunity to review. One of them is a strategic presentation from 2007 where goals are articulated in a list. It's on page 11 for the record. Also other documents including annual reports, proxy statements, internal types of presentations, PowerPoints. And what was remarkable to me, or what was noteworthy, and perhaps you can help me understand it a little bit better, is when goals were articulated in their most elemental form, typically the growth goals were the first ones. Earnings growth, revenue growth, market share growth. And later on, you would also mention what you describe as your public purpose or your mission-driven type of orientation. And again, I'd like to get back to whether you could give us a sense of which ones were the most important. Was that in priority? Was there a weighting that you could assign? You referenced that you looked at them all equally. Would you look at it the same way? Could you characterize for us in a more quantitative manner, perhaps?
I can try. The goals changed over a period of time. So one of the lingering issues post the restatement was that there had been an overemphasis on earnings per share. So for some period of time, the goals, if you look back at the period of 05 and parts of 06, were not related to financial outputs, although there were capital goals per se. They were mostly related to the things that were the most important to the company at that time: get the restatement, get in a good faith, goodwill relationship with the regulator, manage risk, build out. We were under a consent order at the time that I took the job. And there was a list of something like 80 items that needed to be completed for that. So that was an objective in that time. What we tried to do in 07 and 08 was to kind of rebalance those goals out so that we didn't lose sight of the mission, responsibility, regulatory side of it. But, if you're not making money, you're not driving profits, you're not increasing revenues, you're also unable to grow your capital, and therefore you're unable to participate in the marketplace. So I would say that for me, as the CEO of the organization, it was about an equal balance. For folks that work for me, depending on the nature of their job, if it were really, in its extreme example, an origination job or a sales job, that was much more financial goal-oriented. But we also had people who did work with Indian reservations in the West, and they would have mostly goals oriented around the mission. And as you tiered from those folks to me, the proportions would change. But at the top of the organization, I think the concept was always that there was a fine balance to be found there.
So the notion that because of its order, that revenue and earnings growth were not necessarily the driving forces behind your motivations to achieve your corporate or individual goals.
They were a driving force, and in my mind's balance, half of it.
And when you think about compensation, which is for executives at any corporation are really oriented to the performance of the corporate goals, there is an emphasis on stock ownership, which aligns your interests with shareholders. Could you talk about what Wall Street's goals were for your company? I would guess that they were oriented towards earnings and revenue growth. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, just to understand. So what was my impression of what Wall Street expected as kind of output measures for Fannie Mae?
Yes, I would think that as a large stockholder that you would be very sensitive to the orientation of Wall Street. So Wall Street's impression or their expectations for your company and what drove the stock price related to financial performance?
As I think you know from your background, their models are largely related to having financial outputs from the company that go into their models and their expectations for the company's financial performance. I think in addition to that, there was an understanding from the analysts that I talked to that the company had to perform its mission as well and in parallel, or else it would be hard to achieve the financial goals, or the non-achievement of mission goals would translate themselves into headline risk, and the headline risk in and of itself would have an effect on the stock price. So for those the analysts that were on that plane, I think they saw it as a balance, but they didn't necessarily model the mission in the same way that a financial analyst would model a financial goal.
Okay. So there was still a balance there between financial and mission goals, correct?
I think they saw the company in that light, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about the numbers. You were, over the course of your tenure at Fannie Mae, extremely well paid. Both of you were, correct?
I think so.
When you look at how the board determined compensation, could you talk about how they actually got to the numbers? What was the methodology that they used to determine your cash bonus and your stock compensation?
Directionally, although I was not in the room, it was executive session of independent directors, and I did not make any recommendations whatsoever on my own compensation or see it before it went into the room. But I can tell you what the general process was. The general process was that salaries were set to be competitive at a marketplace level. Annual bonuses were determined based upon the achievement of those goals that we talked about. So back to the example, for a salesperson, largely sales and revenue oriented; for a mission person, largely oriented around projects that they were working on or housing goals that they might have brought in the door; and for somebody at our level, kind of an aggregation of all those into our individual. My individual goals were not very distinguishable from the corporate goals, being the top guy. And then the long term was set to a level, to the best of my knowledge, about 70% of the total compensation for comparable positions in the marketplace.
Okay. So the use of comparables was an important part of determining what the actual numbers were. It wasn't so much a measure of performance per se, but what is the marketplace for someone with your skill set, with your responsibilities, that would serve the same types of institutions as yours, that would have similar types of goals, correct?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Okay. So when I go back to the proxy for 2006, on page 33, they also mention that this is in fact correct, that comparability is a very important part of how you measure compensation. And in fact, they give a very specific list of companies. There's 17 of them against whom you are measured to be comparable. And we've now heard for almost 10 minutes about how you served a number of different constituencies: corporate America, your own company, Wall Street, and a mission-driven and a public purpose. But what was really striking to me is in this list of 17 companies, which I will not make you listen to, but I do note that they include AIG, Countrywide, Allstate, American Express, Wachovia, U.S. Bancorp, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, among others. There is not one single company there that is a mission-driven company. And I would wonder if you could explain to me, please, why you did not compare your compensation to, say, someone like the director of the Homeless Coalition. Because if you have a public purpose, then would your comparables not be at least balanced as much as your goals are when you think about your comparables?
That would be the 2 points. That would be the reason that instead of total compensation being pegged to 100% of the market, it was pegged to be 70% of the market. Secondly, my experience in the company was that for the people that we hired or the people that we lost out of the company, most of them tended to go to companies like those that you mentioned. To the extent that people went to Homeless Coalition or many of the other organizations that we know relatively well, it was because they had retired and taken on a job there, or they were going on to do voluntary service. And so while relevant, it wasn't a competitive factor in compensation.
But what you're talking about is comparability and motivation. And to the extent that you have an opportunity to cloak yourself in the public service mission, whether it be in your goals or the carrying out of your activities. I've sat on a public company board, among others. And when you look at comparables, they are supposed to span the waterfront of all of what it is that you do and motivates you. And you've just told us that you were motivated by a public purpose. But I don't see that reflected anywhere in how you actually got paid, which to me suggests that maybe your motivation for doing what you did was not related necessarily in that great of a part to the public mission, but really rather to achieving financial goals.
Well, I have a different opinion, and my opinion is that we had to, during my time, we had to recruit people or try to retain people, and the places that they were going tended to be on the business side of the equation. For example, to hire a senior systems person, a senior risk manager, a senior financial person, the pay for being in a public service-oriented organization, unfortunately, wouldn't be sufficient to attract them to come to the company. So yes, you had an alternative there, and the alternative was probably to get somebody that had less experience in the things that we were looking for: capital markets, risk management, systems technology. But we did bow to the point you raise, I think, by saying, no, actually, we don't pay at 100% of what those comparators pay for. We pay at 70% of that. And that was about the balance that enabled us to attract and retain the talent that we thought we needed to run the organization.
Well, I would say that 75% of a huge amount of money is still a huge amount of money. Furthermore, could you tell me how many consultants you engaged to determine your compensation, both in terms of its amount and also the methodology behind how you determined it?
I think that there were two different firms that were engaged independently, one by the compensation committee of the board, the other by the human resources management, in order to get that comparable data and so forth. And then there was a third override, which is throughout my period, senior executive compensation was submitted to the regulator before it was announced, awarded, or granted.
Do you recall what you paid those firms?
I'm sorry, I don't.
If it were, say, for one of them in the range of $700,000 for one assignment, does that ring a bell?
It doesn't. It just wasn't. I can attempt to find out for you, but I just don't know what the number was.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. There's some time left on your clock. All right. Mr. Wallison.
Well, now for some easy questions. Mr. Mudd, I would agree with you that right after you took over as the head of Fannie, you did reach out to people in the community in Washington to try to gather the critics' views as well as the views of others in order to do a better job. And you were hit by a terrible crisis that we've heard about from, I assure you, many other witnesses who have been before us. But the Chairman Angelides, did focus on what I think is one of the most important questions that I think we'll have to resolve, and that is the reason that Fannie acquired so many subprime and Alt-A loans. Between Fannie and Freddie, there were about 12 million such loans out of a total probably of about 27 million loans, subprime and Alt-A loans altogether in our economy. So it was about, between these two companies, about 2/5 of all the loans that were likely to fail when the bubble deflated. So I think it's quite important for us to try to find out why exactly this was done. Now, it seems to me that there are three possible ways, possible reasons for proceeding in this direction, acquiring what were acknowledged to be risky loans, subprime and Alt-A mortgages, in other words, between 2005 and 2007, which everyone seems to agree were the ones that have caused most of the financial difficulties for you. First of all, you've mentioned market share, expand market share. Maybe you bought them in order to expand your market share. You said that was a secondary consideration, but that's one that has been repeated frequently in the media as the reason for competing with Wall Street or acquiring these loans. You were competing with Wall Street, wanted to increase your market share. I think that the documentary evidence, and we'll go through that a little bit, does confirm that this was a secondary matter, if even that. The second idea is that you wanted to make profits, and we did hear this from an academic expert who the commission had engaged a few weeks ago. That is that you acquired these loans these subprime and Alt-A loans, in order to make money from them. And the third is, of course, to comply with the HUD's affordable housing regulations, and that is what we've been referring to, or you've been referring to, as your mission. I'll try to unpack all of these things because they are, of course, in your mind, and they should be in your mind, all mixed together because they were all very important to the kind of thing you were trying to do with this company. But let me just mention that the HUD housing goals did increase substantially during the time that we're talking about here. They started at 30% when they first came into effect in the early 90s, but in 2000 they became 50%. And what that meant is that all of the loans that you bought, of the loans that you bought from originators, 50% of those, and you know this, of course, but for the audience they might not, 50% of those had to be to people who are at or below the median income in the areas where they were living. So it was 50% starting in the year 2000. It then increased to 52% in 2005, 53% in 2006, and 55% in 2007. In other words, and some of this was in your prepared remarks, and I got some of the same sense listening to Mr. Levin and to you, that you were really under pressure from HUD here. They, despite the fact that you had difficulties, accounting difficulties, which required you to spend a lot of time on writing your accounting, getting things back and course in your accounting, HUD was not giving up on you. They were pressing you to continue to make more investments in these affordable housing loans. So it was going up during exactly the time that we're talking about, between 2005 and 2007. Now, let's consider the things that I was referring to before. First, this question of the market share. Now, the chairman made a reference to the presentation by Tom Lund in June of 2005. And in there, he really said, we're facing a choice here. We either meet the market, which meant that we're going to have to change the way we do business. We're going to have to go after more of these subprime and Alt-A loans because that's where things seem to be going, or we should stay the course. And he considered whether you had the resources to do that, not the financial resources, but whether you had the resources of personnel and skill and so forth. And he said, no, actually. Lack of capabilities. We lack the capability to go into this market. We lack the knowledge of credit risks. We lack the willingness to compete on market price. We lack a value proposition for subprime. And we lack a conduit capacity. And there are also regulatory concerns. So basically, he says, realistically, we are not in a position to meet the market today. This is in the middle of 2005. Therefore, we recommend something you've already mentioned, and that is, and Mr. Levin has, the stay the course idea. And it appears that you did follow this advice, although it wasn't quite as you suggested, just not going into subprime. It was to kind of, as he put it in his memo, underground efforts. Develop a subprime infrastructure, develop modeling capabilities for alternative markets, and develop a conduit capacity. So does all that sound right to you about the middle of 2005? You are agreeing with that?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, there is no documentary support for a contrary decision on this market share or relevancy issue after that mid-June presentation and recommendation. There's nothing until 2007. And there's a very important document in 2007. I want to be sure I know that you wrote that. There's an 84-page comprehensive thing that says it's called the Fannie Mae Strategic Plan 2007 to 2012. Was that your work?
It sounds like something I would have done, yes.
I mean, it's a very fine piece of work, I might say, and very comprehensive. But I just wanted to be sure this was the product of management's work coming together to decide what the strategy of the company ought to be.
There was we did a document every year. In one of those years, it was more extensive, and without seeing it, it's hard to be affirmative. But that
84-page document.
That sounds
quite
like
thorough.
an annual strategic planning document that the board would read before going to its annual strategic planning session.
Okay, now it was the data. Oddly enough, it was not dated, but it did refer to the mortgage meltdown as something you had to deal with, and so I would place it then probably in June, July, or August of 2007. Would that be about right for when you had these regular planning meetings?
They were normally in the summer, yes.
Okay. And it really focuses, of course, from its title, 2007 to 2012, it focuses on what Fannie will do in the future. It seems pretty clear from that report, however, that there was no plan at this time to move strongly into the subprime and Alt-A market. What we see is that is what is being decided, what has been decided and put in the plan for the future. You say, after months of research, and this is from the plan, after months of research, analysis, discussion, preparation, our senior management team met for 2 days in June in a college classroom near the Fannie Mae headquarters, and we made several strategic decisions at that point. Item 1 on that list was deepen and broaden business to maximize value, of course, right? Item 2 was to add more credit-sensitive assets. And you say, under our new strategy, we will take and manage more mortgage credit risk, moving deeper into the credit pool to serve a large and growing part of the mortgage market. Helping reputable lenders serve emerging borrowers provides an enormous opportunity for Fannie Mae to grow, provide value to customers, the market, and shareholders, and the and is emphasized in this, expand our affordable housing mission. So it seems to me, and I'd like you to address this, it seems to me that actually only in mid-2007, when this piece was written, was it really decided to expand market share by, quote, moving deeper into the credit pool to serve a large and growing part of the mortgage market. Would that seem right to you?
I'll add some perspective to it, Mr. Walson. Going back to the 2000 and was Mr. Lund's 05 or 06?
That was 05.
05.
Middle of 05, about June of 05.
A process that we would use not uncommonly to discuss the strategy was to kind of create a framework that sets up two alternatives that are starker than the alternatives that exist in real life. And as a result of kind of setting those bookends and having the debate, the outcome was what you described the single-family head of business recommending, which was that we stay the course, we continue our investment, we continue the process, we continue to emphasize the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, but that at the same time we develop the capabilities to understand the business. By way of reference, the book, Fannie Mae's investment or participation or guarantee of Alt-A goes all the way back to 1999.
Right.
So the reason I point that out is that Mr. Lund's presentation was part of a continuum, and participation in that business was part of a continuum. Right. And if you go through you go through the years, the numbers that I have here, the Alt-A business goes from 2000, $10 billion, 30, 60, 90, down a little bit, then 100, and then it stays at about 100. Certainly a significant part of the book. But the process was to develop those capabilities. The construct of your question was, market share, profit, HUD goals. My answer is yes. I cannot make any apologies for trying to earn a profit when I was running Fannie Mae. If you can't make a profit when you're running the business,
right,
you can't do the mission, you can't earn a return, you can't raise capital, and all of that. So the question was, do you do it prudently? And I think that the ultimate measure of prudence is that a big problem, and not perfect to be sure, but Fannie Mae's participation in those segments to this day, to my knowledge, is better by a factor of about 2 than the same loans and the same securities that were done
right,
by the banks and the private market. So I think that the process was solid. The approach built itself out. There were myriad activities going on between Mr. Lund's presentation and the strategic document you referenced, including building out. We hired people from the industry who had been in the subprime business, that had specialization in modeling around Alt-A and all of that. So as we did that, that gave us the ability to continue to participate in the market.
Yes, absolutely. You were following the Lund recommendations, but what I'm just trying to pin down is kind of the date when the decision was actually made to go more deeply into this subprime and Alt-A market. Now, I want to just mention something for the sake of everybody who's listening. Indeed, Fannie and Freddie, but Fannie particularly, was required in the early 1990s, as I suggested, to start making these kinds of investments. This was not just something that occurred between 2005 and 2007. In fact, in 1999, there was a major HUD press conference where the then Secretary Cuomo, announced that you would be required, you and Freddie would be required, with new affordable housing requirements, to make $2.4 trillion in affordable housing loans starting right then. And in fact, there was a statement by President Clinton saying this was wonderful because home ownership in the United States was increasing substantially. And that shows, in fact, that you were under really substantial, I think, political pressure to make sure that you did these things, because not only was it important for all of us to see that home ownership is increasing in the United States — this is something Americans have always wanted — but it was a particular interest of the Clinton administration and then subsequently the Bush administration. Both of them were focused on improving home ownership, and I would assume you would agree with that.
I would agree with that. My short
Mr. Chairman, I'd yield the Commissioner an additional 5 minutes.
Thank you.
My short comment would be that because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac don't originate, the business that comes in their door depends upon what originators or others are willing to originate and then willing to sell to them. But the businesses being so big, usually an actuarial sample, if you will, of the market would come in. And until the point when the housing goals went north of 50%, just by virtue of being there and receiving loans, the companies generally were able to reach their housing goals with a reasonable degree of effort, but not untoward. The mathematical conundrum that I have always had, Mr. Wallison, is, and you touched upon this, is, as far as I understand it, median is about 50%. So when you're required to have 57% of your business be below 50%, that gap of 7% began to, you had to create not just a normal home for those mortgages, you had to create attraction for those loans to come in the door, and that took an enormous amount of our time and attention to continue to try to chase that wheel.
Right, and indeed, you make that clear because we're going to I want to turn now to this question of, could this possibly have been for the purpose of making profits? responding to, as you were speaking with the chairman and Ms. Murren, you were talking about your responsibility to the capital markets to keep the company together as a profit-making operation, hopefully even a AAA operation, so that you would continue to be able to function in that part of your mission. So the question is, could you have been buying these subprime and Alt-A loans in order to be profitable? And as I suggested, we had heard from an academic student of Fannie and Freddie that that was one of the motives. However, in this 2007 report that we've been talking about, you say this: the HUD Affordable Housing Goals are a public manifestation of our mission. Our strategy of expanding our credit risk appetite is critical in meeting these goals. For 2004 to 2008, the goals require, and this is exactly what you're saying, the goals require Fannie Mae's acquisitions to finance a greater percentage of low and moderate income family mortgages than the proportion the market will produce. That's the point. That is especially true as housing affordability, the combination of home prices, mortgage costs, and incomes, has fallen. We had to absorb significant costs to meet the HUD purchase money goals in 2006, and we are struggling to meet the goals and sub-goals in 2007. We will continue to pursue every reasonable opportunity to expand our purchases of goals-eligible mortgages. So, to me, at least, and I'd like your sense of what that language meant, but to me it says, these things are costly to do. We are not making money on these things. They are expensive, and we're struggling to do it. Is that your assessment too, or what do you think it meant?
Your impression is correct, and if willing, Mr. Levin was right in the middle of that analysis, and he may be in a better position to answer.
Perfectly. I have questions for Mr. Levin, but that's a question of time, and I probably won't have any. So why don't you just go ahead, Mr. Levin, and respond to that.
If I could for 1 second, Commissioner, respectfully, I just wanted to make sure that I clarified the relationship between the compensation and profitability or Wall Street expectations. It's not so much I meant, and perhaps I didn't express myself clearly, that Wall Street expects firms to be profitable. It's that they expect them to grow, and they expect them to grow at a certain rate.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, yield the gentleman additional 2 minutes.
2 minutes, and then we'll add another 30 seconds to that to accommodate Ms. Murren's comments. So why don't you put it to 2:30?
Mr. Commissioner, just rephrase what you would like me to address.
Oh, well, the paragraph that I just read said, to me at least, and I can read it, I'll just read portions of it again. This is at the very end of this paragraph, and Mr. Mudd, who I think was the author here, has written, we had to absorb significant costs to meet the HUD purchase money goals in 2006, and we are struggling to meet the goals and sub-goals in 2007. What that says to me is this was not a profitable activity. This was something you were doing because you had to do it.
Yeah. Much of the business that met our housing goals came through standard channels at standard returns. But because the goals were set at higher levels than what the market was producing, we had to make special efforts that involved outreach, pricing adjustments, underwriting adjustments. And there was a whole set of business that we did at returns that were less than our normal returns.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, I'm not saying that you lost money. We don't know that, actually. I don't know that even your accounting would be able to show us that. But it was clear that you were not making the kinds of money on your affordable housing activities that you were making on your standard kinds of activities. And so this was something that had to be done for mission purposes, but not because it was a profitable activity in preference to, as it was, for example, for the Wall Street firms, it was probably very profitable for them. You have a completely different set of standards and your business model is different from the Wall Street firms, and so for you, it probably wasn't profitable, and I think this paragraph suggests that that's true. So if I could get some time later, I'd like to, but I don't know that I will.
Thank you, Mr.
very
Wallace.
much for answering those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. And Mr. Georgiou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, I'd like to follow up on one thing I just got confused about. I understood that Alt-A mortgages actually did not count toward the affordable housing goals of the mission. Is that correct?
It depends. So the affordable housing goals related to the income level of the borrower and where the loan was located. And there were Alt-A loans that did count, and there were Alt-A loans that did not count.
Right. But I understood in your interview with our staff that you suggested that for the most part, Alt-A loans generally did not count.
My recollection that in the aggregate, that Alt-A was less rich than the goals, but there would be portions of Alt-A that would have contributed to the goals.
Right. But to the extent that you actually financed Alt-A loans that didn't contribute to the mission, then they would actually reduce your ability to meet the mission because they would increase the denominator, the total number of loans that you had to compare your mission-related loans to. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And you did, nonetheless, increase your financing of Alt-A loans, I guess about 1% a year for every year. It looks like from 04 at 8%, 05, 9%, 06, 11%, and 07, 12%. Is that right? These are figures that I'm looking at from your purchases of non-traditional single-family mortgages from our staff report, which you may not have seen.
I'm not familiar with those set of numbers.
Okay,
Sorry.
very good. Let's see. Also, in a summary that we have of the interview that was conducted with you by our staff, it says that in response to a question about Fannie Mae's increased acquisition of private label securities with PLS, that you said something to the effect, PLS was considered a money-making activity, it was all positive economics, and it was very conscious that subprime PLS was housing goals rich. And so subprime PLS was also one of the initiatives, if you will, that filled the housing goal gap. There was no trade-off between making money and hitting goals. It was a very broad brush effort that could be characterized as win-win-win. Money, goals, and market share. Do you recall saying words to that effect to our staff?
I do not recall those exact words, but I would say that the subprime PLS, we expected those to be profitable, and those did contribute significantly to the achievement of the housing goals.
Okay. All right. So really, there were at least two mandates that you were following here in a lot of your acquisitions of subprime and Alt-A loans, which was to increase your profitability, increase your market share, and meet your housing goals, meet your affordable housing goals. Would that be fair to say?
Yes.
Mr. Levin? Mr. Mudd, rather, you're nodding your head as well.
I'm nodding my head because I agree with
Okay.
all of those were factors.
Very well. Thank you. I want to turn to compensation for just a second because it's already been touched upon, but I think it's worthy of a little bit further elaboration. During the years of 2000 to 2003, the OFEO budget, that is the entire budget of your regulator, ranged between $19 million and $30 million. And in all those years, the total compensation of the top four executives at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac exceeded the budget of the entire regulator. I mean, it was $33.6 million in 2000, almost $27 million in 2001, $26 million in 2002, up to $51.5 million in 2003. It strikes me that it sort of dwarfs the ability of the regulator to really play a significant role. Would you concur that the regulator really didn't have adequate resources to do the kind of regulation that would be customary in a financial institution? Maybe Mr. Levin, since you had longer experience really at the agency. Could you speak to that?
I really couldn't. I think that would be a matter for them to answer.
Well, I'm sure they will, but I was wondering if your experience as the regulated entity might give you some insight in that regard. Mr. Mudd?
I thought and said at the time and through my tenure that I thought a strong, credible, well-funded regulator made sense. And that wasn't just apple pie and motherhood, because it was actually helpful to me going out and meeting with international debt investors, MBS investors, and others to say, the short story of Fannie Mae, government-sponsored enterprise, public-private mission, SEC registered, and by the way, we're regulated by a credible, effective, well-funded regulator. Their level of funding was set by Congress every year, which history can decide whether that made sense or not. So we didn't have anything to do with that per se.
Well, it might be a little bit too much to say that you didn't have anything to do with it, because if I recall, you lobbied against the increase in budgets that OFEO requested fairly considerably. Is that not true?
I did not myself lobby against the OFEO budgets.
But didn't Fannie hire lobbyists to lobby against it?
I don't know. Not in my tenure as CEO.
Well,
the thing that I would say, Commissioner, that might be helpful to the discussion is that OFEO's heritage as a financial regulator of a complicated institution, coming out of HUD and staffing itself with teams that were available and therefore perhaps not at the top levels of other regulators and examiners, and the statutory limitations that existed around the bifurcation of OFEO being a safety and soundness regulator and HUD being a mission regulator, made it, in my experience, running or working in regulated institutions over the years, not very effective.
okay, thank you. Just for the record, I think the Fannie's lobbying expenditures, according to our staff investigation from 1998 to 2008, were roughly $80 million, 80, which I suppose one could argue, in light of the enormous lobbying that goes on by financial services companies generally, is modest. But in an overall simply viewed, $80 million is a considerable amount of money to be lobbying. I mean, it was, in many instances, in some years, almost comparable to the entire budget of the regulator.
Just a comment there, Commissioner, that
Sure.
Within the housing finance industry, it is an industry which is. I cut down lobbying during my time there and brought external lobbying inside. Had people who actually knew about the company do any lobbying, and we were requested to come up here quite often and talk about our programs, our efforts, our capital, or what have you. So it was important to have that interface. But with a company so intimately involved, government, in fact, in the name of its business as a government-sponsored enterprise, some of that came with the territory. I agree that there are limits and there are appropriate ways to do it, and we tried to follow those during my time.
At one point, there was a suggestion by Mr. Falcone, who we'll hear from after you this afternoon, that Fannie Mae executives acted on a plan to have Senator Kit Bond initiate an investigation of OFEO by the HUD Inspector General in an effort to head off an investigation that they were doing into Fannie's accounting practices. Do you have any familiarity with that particular effort?
No, other than that I recall that Senator Bond, as a general matter, had regulatory budgets and FAO's budgets and operations as an issue that he was focused on.
In what respect? He was focused on that they were excessive?
I think I just thought of I remember thinking of him as sort of the watchdog person in Congress around the issues of FAO budgets and operations, and there lots of people had interest in the regulatory structure of Fannie and Freddie.
Right, but he wasn't in favor of additional regulation. He was, additional oversight, but lesser oversight of Fannie and Freddie at the time.
I don't remember that. I think most of the plurality of the people that I talked to were generally interested in better oversight, including both Director Falcone and Director Lockhart, and I shared that. But that's
okay. Mr. Levin, do you have any recollection of that intervention?
I don't.
Okay. Let me try and go back to capital briefly. Secretary Paulson described the GSE's capital as flimsy capital. Would you agree with that characterization? Mr. Levin?
Well, we had regulatory capital requirements, and then we also did our own internal analysis on appropriate levels of capital. On the regulatory side, there were what we called the minimum capital levels, which were leverage ratios, and there was also a risk-based regulatory standard that was set by stressing our business from a credit perspective and an interest rate perspective, and from that developing an amount of capital to absorb any losses. My recollection is when I left the company, we were in compliance with both numbers, the leverage ratio, but also the risk-based capital ratio, which attempted to establish the correct capital levels based on the exact product that we had, and then stressing the markets.
Yeah, but it wasn't stressed adequately in retrospect. Would that be fair to say?
I think one of the lessons from the experience is that scenarios that people thought were really adverse scenarios, that one of the lessons is you can have even more adverse scenarios.
Indeed, and that's really what we ended up facing, which put us into this crisis. But during 06 and 07, your modeled loan guarantee fees were higher than the fees you actually charged, were they not?
I don't have specific recollection, but that would happen from time to time.
So if you didn't charge the fee that you modeled, then you're charging the lower fees meant that effectively, then the model fee, effectively you weren't pricing the MBS guarantees commensurate with the risk that you had established yourselves. Is that not correct?
I would say, I think the perspective I would put on that is that the models would set a target fee for the business. And sometimes we were able to get that target fee. Sometimes we were able to get more than that target fee. Sometimes the market only permitted us to get less than that target fee. So, for example, and I'm just making these numbers up to give the conceptual example, the the model might say, that the fee ought to be at a level that produces a 16% rate of return. But what was available in the marketplace was a 15% rate of return. Not what the model was as a target, but something less that we still might consider acceptable. And if we consider those numbers acceptable, that we would do business at less than the model fees, although we always had plans and we always pushed the businesses to develop plans on how to get back up to the model fees.
All right, I will yield 3 minutes. I know we're on it to keep on schedule. 3 minutes.
Thank you. I guess I'm trying to get to what you could have done to have enhanced your capital structure, your capital base, to have avoided some of the problems. I mean, obviously, I understand the market didn't want to pay them, but if your model suggested that the risk of the associated asset that you were buying required that kind of fee to provide you sufficient return, it seems to me it was a deficiency to not attempt to collect it, or to choose not to purchase those assets unless you could actually obtain the guarantee fee that your model suggested. Mr. Mudd, you were looking to try to respond to that.
Just to say that one option here would be to trade at market and then therefore be in the position of unconsciously knowing, and we're talking about matters of single-digit basis points here, whether you're being accretive or decretive in terms of individual transactions. What I always thought the models helped do was to enable us to decide consciously, do we want to give up a little potential return here because there's more volume, or because they're more goals rich, or because of some other exogenous factor. The models and the model fee are one component of the relationship. At the other extreme, you can't run a business that's active in the capital markets every minute, as you know, just by saying, I can't answer your question. The model has to answer the question for you, because the models themselves have to be dynamic and reflective of what's going on in the marketplace.
Understood. Let me just turn real quickly, I've only got a minute left, to a couple of possible accounting issues that I think were of some significance. Did you actually not record losses on delinquent loans until they were 24 months delinquent? Was that the policy at Fannie, Mr. Levin?
I don't recall.
And were you required to repurchase loans from MBS Trust once they became delinquent and then record them at fair value on the balance sheet? Mr. Mudd, if you recall?
To my recollection, the way that the accounting handled a purchase of a loan out of a security, that loan had to come out and be marked at fair value, and then should it recover, the income off of that loan would amortize back into the.
But that didn't happen until 24 months after the loan became delinquent, isn't that right? Which is a little bit late in the accounting world.
Right.
I'll just leave it at that.
All right.
Time is done. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Mr. Holtz-Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time to be with us today. One of the very clear messages that both of you shared with us is that the business model that was Fannie Mae simply could not survive the precipitous price declines we saw in residential real estate in the United States. And so I guess my first question is, what did your internal risk metrics tell you you could survive? What kind of price declines were survivable given your business model?
The models ran thousands of paths, as you can imagine, and at any time through the summer and fall of 2008, we were disclosing what our best estimation was of what the likely losses were going to be. We found ourselves through that period basically not being able to imagine how bad reality would be. So looking backwards, those estimates of what the losses were ultimately going to be were trailing what the market was actually delivering as home prices fell and delinquencies went up and the macroeconomy had its effect. But we and outside advisors as well, looking at our capital, thought that was sufficient to withstand what I called earlier the 30-year flood. But just by way of reference, what that 30-year flood was, since the estimates had to be based on a sample of real data, you couldn't make up the data, we went back to California in the 1990s, the Texas oil patch in the 1980s, some of the severe interest rate dislocations over a period of time. And we took those scenarios and multiplied them by 50 states and then extended them over a period of time to do a stress assessment of whether we would have sufficient capital. And as we all know now, the reality of it was that 2008 and 2009, and until home prices eventually bottomed, were worse than 50 times Texas oil patch or 50 times California.
So that was the outer bound of what you considered. I was just curious, how bad you contemplated in your stress testing of your portfolio.
Well, I think the answer is that our best estimate of the most likely outcome was what we were disclosing. And
it's not a matter of disclosure. I mean, the question is, what constituted stress in your scenarios?
With what I just described.
50 times oil patch, California, something like that.
Yeah.
And that was a standard internal risk assessment being done on a quantitative basis ongoing.
Yes.
Okay. As things developed and you realized that you were missing, did you alter those stress tests in any way?
The stress tests were updated on a regular basis. I don't remember what the regularity was. Within some number of months, to reflect the reality. As I was describing in the earlier part of the answer to your question, I wrote it down here somewhere. As of mid-2007, our internal estimate of conventional conforming home prices was a 1% decline for 2007, a 1% increase for 2008, a 3% increase for 2009, a 4% increase for 2010. So that close to the collapse of housing prices, we were still estimating that the odds were things were going to remain within their historical parameters.
And just to be clear, that constituted stress.
No. Constituted.
I'm interested in provisioning against.
There's a stress case on the downside. There's a nice case on the upside, which
what I'm interested in.
And then a
stress test on the downside.
The stress case on the downside would have.
Mr. Chairman, it's very difficult to follow the questions and answers when the witness overrides the question of the commissioner.
Let Mr. Holtz-Aiken ask the question and then respond. And
I don't want this hearing to look like some of the shows on television.
And let's add a minute back on for Mr. Holtz-Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My interest is in the internal risk management procedures at Fannie Mae, which ultimately failed and left the taxpayers with the single largest bill we will face in this episode. And I am curious as to the nature of those procedures, their quantitative assessment of the risk, not likely outcomes, but worst case and downside risk, and the degree to which they were updated in light of clear misses, and how they interacted with other mitigants against risk, holding additional capital, which you have already expressed an assertion that you held adequate capital from all internal risk metrics, despite the evidence to the contrary, and stronger regulation, which would have put you in a better prudential position. So that's where I'm going. It's not a mystery, and I would just like to know how it was done.
I apologize. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I'll try to be brief, but we had an independent risk management committee of the board. We had an independent view from AFEO, who effectively ran a parallel model with their own set of stress scenarios. We had an independent chief risk officer who reported dotted line to me and straight line to the board. Under his organization, we had individuals who focused on single-family credit, multifamily credit, et cetera. We had models which were independently verified, and we used an increasing amount of independent verification to basically develop richer data as it became clear that we were going through the phenomenon that I described to you of the models not being able to catch up with the reality. And those were updated. They were a topic of conversation at weekly management meetings, and I think in the year of either 07 or 08, the board met something like 100 times, and this would have been an item of discussion at that level. And the process, our chief risk officer had come out of the money center bank that we had judged had the best process, and we asked basically to install something that looked like a blueprint of that process. And that in summary is how the system was set up and operated. And then those scenarios that we described in the earlier question were input and run through.
Are you aware that yesterday we received testimony from the Comptroller of the Currency, Mr. Dugan, who said that when invited by the Fed to review the risk management procedures in the capital held at Fannie Mae, was shocked that they did not meet the standards that, for example, a national bank would have, and that the capital was so inadequate? How do you react to that?
I react to it that Fannie Mae wasn't a national bank, and under its regulatory regime, it was operating within the capital standards that it had, A, and that, B, we were aggressively raising capital throughout 07 and into 08. So I don't want to dispute the notion that more capital was a better thing, and yet more capital would have been even a better thing. There are natural financial limits, if you will, on the amount of capital that you can actually raise in the real world. There was a point in 08, maybe even earlier than that, where it became clear that the bar shouldn't be minimum statutory capital, that it should be higher than that, and we tried to operate accordingly.
If I could just get, before we leave this, and I appreciate your forthcoming on this, what precisely was the number for the downside scenario? Was this a 5% decline? Was it a 10% decline?
I will try. I will be forthcoming, but I can't tell you anything that I don't specifically remember, because based upon what the inputs and the methodology were, you could come up with a variety of different numbers. But the last output was the one that I described to you in the end of 08. I don't know what the outputs turned out to be subsequently once you had the real data in terms of what actually happened. The downside was consistent with the structure and the calculations that we went through to develop regulatory capital. They were consistent.
I want to make sure I understand the business model, because it's always been of interest to me. There were really two things that you did. One was to purchase mortgages, provide a guarantee, and generate MBSs for sale. And the second business was to borrow and hold those risky MBSs in a large portfolio. Fair characterization of the basic overall operation?
Close?
Mr. Chairman, I yield the Commissioner 5 additional minutes.
Thank you. And in this spectrum of purposes that you had to pursue, the public purposes, the profit purposes, what purpose did the portfolio hold?
When an originator originates mortgages and builds up a book of loans that they then put into a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac security, they are the originator of those loans, obviously, but they still hold those loans, but that are now in the form of a mortgage-backed security on their books. The reason that the mortgage-backed security is more valuable per se on their books is because it's a straightaway Fannie Mae, MBS, AAA security. And therefore, it has a liquidity value in that the CFO or the treasurer, whatever, of the bank can get those sold into the marketplace very expeditiously should they have the need, which they couldn't do with the individual loans. One of the things, and to my view, one of the most important things that the portfolio did was it provided the liquidity to ensure that even at the worst times in the marketplace, 9/11 or parts of 2008, there was always going to be a bid out there for those mortgages. And so we sort of were able to achieve a liquidity premium on the price of the MBS through the existence of the portfolio, because there was certainly no guarantee that anybody else would be out there in tight markets.
So, number one, it was a AAA security because it was guaranteed, right? It was a guarantee provided there, so they had security against it. But number two, you're saying that by already holding $3.2 trillion worth of assets, this gave them an assurance you would buy more?
No,
How does that help?
That wasn't what I said. It's the question of what was the purpose of being in that business, and that was one of the purposes of being in the business.
Another purpose to be in that business would be to simply borrow at what was an implicit government guarantee very cheaply and invest in a very risky set of assets that, by your own admission, got riskier as time went on, and take advantage of the implicit backing of the taxpayer to make money. How do you feel about that?
Not in agreement. The overwhelming bulk of the assets that were in the portfolio were actually typical conventional conforming mortgages, and so the notion that the portfolio was a locus of riskier loans than the broad book was not accurate in my experience.
So that you held a different set of assets in your portfolio than you actually were bundling into MBSs? Because you've said you've made a conscious continual shift into Alt-A's, greater in magnitude 2003, 2004, 2005. Didn't your portfolio also become riskier as a result?
Over time, the portfolio grew, and over time, as the portfolio participated in investments in private label securities and other investments consistent with the market. But I guess the point I was trying to make was that directionally and qualitatively, the businesses are different, but the classes of assets in which the two businesses are investing are largely the same.
But over time, by process of elimination, there was not a decision to hold greater capital backing, stayed at the regulatory minimums. There wasn't a decision in any way to stress test more aggressively until very late. Indeed, the only thing that seems to have happened is you've relied more and more on the ability of the taxpayer to pick up the pieces when it falls apart. What did you do in the presence of this very large risky portfolio and what others have testified to be sort of inadequate internal risk management to ensure that you didn't end up in the position you ultimately ended up in?
I'll start, and Mr. Levin might have some additional comments.
I would be happy to hear it.
If that's okay.
And I want to point out, this is not something that is a revelation circa 2010. This is a concern circa 2003 when I testified at the Congressional Budget Office. This is something that many people predicted. And knowing that, I am curious that it was allowed to happen.
By and large, the locus of the credit crisis has been around credit risk and not interest rate risk. The risk fundamentally taken in the portfolio is interest rate risk. And the procedures around managing interest rate, we've talked mostly today about credit risk, had the same degree of controls and limits and models and the other things that you would expect. We raised capital, we reduced limits, we charged higher fees, we focused all of the organization on the risk management within the portfolio. So I guess maybe
Mr. Levin briefly, and then I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I wanted to go back to one of your initial questions, which was why the portfolio? What purpose did it serve?
Yield the gentleman an additional 2 minutes for purposes of the witness answering the question.
Thank you.
And our portfolio served a very important liquidity function in the marketplace, and I would describe 3 levels of liquidity. One would just be general contribution to liquidity, which help reduce mortgage rates, which help people get into homes. A second dimension of it would be in periods of stress in the marketplace when other sources didn't exist. The portfolio was a critical function, and Mr. Mudd mentioned 9/11, and I think the 2007 and 2008 period would be additional examples. And then a third function of liquidity for the portfolio would be for the class of mortgages for which an active securitization market did not exist. And I think a prime example of this would have been the multifamily market, which over this time period there really wasn't much of a securitization market, and virtually all of that business was done in whole loan form in the portfolio. And then just the final comment I would make on purposes of the portfolio, that there were also products that would contribute to our affordable housing goals that were better done through the portfolio as opposed to being better done through the other line of business. And so I would put what we did in subprime in that example.
I thank you both for this. I do want to reserve the right to come back to and pursue some of this, and just close with the observation that even a very weak regulator took the very first opportunity it had to limit the size of your portfolios, which suggests they were not entirely in the interests of your public purpose mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holtz-Aiken. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. Many in our country have believed that the housing bubble may very well have been a significant contributor to the financial collapse. And arguably, Fannie and Freddie probably had the best view of the U.S. housing market, particularly the segment of the market targeted at low to mid-income buyers. And while the private label security guys or the Johnny-come-latelys, you guys have been in the market since 1938. No question about that. I think if you look at the period where house ownership or home ownership in our country grew substantially, there was about a 4 to 5 year period where there was a 10% increase in home ownership, quite substantially from historical norms. And so I guess my question is, at what point does someone who has such great market knowledge and has a public mission have a responsibility to also say something is going wrong here, and therefore use your knowledge of the market to tell HUD and to tell Congress, slow down, something's not right? Mr. Mudd?
I think there is that responsibility. We had those conversations throughout the rulemaking process as HUD established the housing goals. The other side of the coin a little bit to me was that when I first started to look at the data of home ownership, there was a 10 or 15, maybe more percent gap in home ownership rates between minorities and the majority. There was clearly ground to be made up there on a fairness basis. And President Bush had a minority home ownership initiative that we participated in. There were similar programs in earlier administrations. And a lot of the increase in home ownership was driven by folks able to access the home ownership market for the first time. In retrospect, I think that it got too high. At the time, it reflected that there had been no progress for a period of time, and then suddenly, in my interpretation, as a confluence of all the different programs and focuses and initiatives and so forth that were underway, there was progress, and I thought that that was good progress.
So, but it is true that part of that increase in home ownership was attributable to loans that were originated that had very, very low standards of origination, and therefore could have contributed to an eventual collapse. So the blind pursuit of metrics put our country at risk.
Well, as I've tried to indicate before, the business that Fannie Mae did was an order of two better than the market. Even writ large to this day, about 70% of the loans in the market are Fannie or Freddie loans in total, and about 30% of the total market delinquency is Fannie Freddie. 30% of the loans in the market are held by private institutions, wherein reside 70% of the delinquency. So I think we did act with prudence. We did act as a braking force. In retrospect, you're absolutely right. Folks that get in near the end of the home price rise with lower equity in the house are going to be the first to get hurt. And unfortunately, those were a lot of the emerging homeowners I was just describing.
Mr. Levin, you were with Fannie for a very, very long time. Would you comment on that part of the responsibility you have to act on market knowledge?
Yeah. We had continual conversations with our regulators about what we were seeing in the marketplace, and so How
about with Congress or with HUD?
With the HUD.
Okay.
And there were conversations with I think all parts of the government, but with HUD, we had regular quarterly meetings where we would discuss issues like this, and they were usually centered around our housing goals and what we were seeing in connection with our housing goals, and we would express what we thought to them as part of these meetings.
So you could certainly describe your mission as somewhat schizophrenic, the cross between trying to serve the public's interests and the interest of shareholders. As you look at, with the benefit of hindsight now, at what has happened with the GSEs, is this a mission that really should have been undertaken? Particularly as it was structured.
It's, in my mind, Commissioner, it's the most important question in the whole discussion, and it goes to a broad determination of whether you want American government in some way to tweak the system to the advantage of home ownership.
But I'm asking for your opinion.
My opinion is that with where we are at 90-something% of the loans in the market today being run through the government in one form or another, the notion that you would go back to a fully private structure cannot be logistically accomplished in our lifetimes. I do think that a consensus around what the model should be is important. If it were for me to do, I would have the GSEs focused on principally first-time home buyers, getting folks onto the ladder in the first place, under terms generally predictable payment, fixed rate, 30-year loans with 20% down, the old-fashioned way. There would be a portfolio. The portfolio would not be as large as it has been. And there would have to be some, in my view, explication of exactly what the relationship is between these entities and the government.
So what would that change do to your housing goals? If that's the more plausible approach to the market, what should the housing goals therefore be?
Well, it always seemed to me, sir, that if you were going to have requirements like the housing goals, they should also be balanced by the capabilities of the organization. So I think the notion of if you have entities like this, they would be supervised and regulated to attain mission goals has to make sense. To my judgment, the flaw in the I guess it's now an old goals regime because it doesn't apply anymore. The flaw in the goals regime was that it was set without respect to the market, which effectively put the companies in a position of having to outstrip the market in order.
So the goals should have been lower.
The goals should have been floating with respect to where the market was
But
on
they
some
would have
periodic
floated down.
basis, as opposed to straight lined under the numbers that Mr. Wallison described.
Mr. Levin?
My view on the housing goals is that numbers just for numbers aren't useful. Then what would have been more useful would have been to identify what really were the problems in the housing and mortgage markets, and then to direct the companies to address what were really considered real problems. And so, for example, if policymakers would determine that there was a problem with new rental housing for seniors, just making up an example, to direct the enterprises to help fix that problem would make sense to me, because it was, if that was a problem, then it was a problem worth fixing. And if the next year it was another problem, then to have us address that other problem, but not numbers for numbers' sake where there might not be a problem.
Was there an opportunity perhaps to reprioritize your charter and focus on those things that were most relevant in the marketplace that would have made the institution more sound?
That wasn't done at my pay grade.
Well, Mr. Mudd, I guess you got the only pay grade that it might have been done on.
It comes with the territory, it would seem. I'm sorry,
Could you have reclassified or changed your charter to go focus on the things that would have made this institution more sound?
I think that the thing that would have made the institution more sound or have produced a different outcome would have been for it to have become over time a more normal financial institution, able to diversify, able to allocate capital, able to be long or short the market, able to operate internationally. And if the trade for that would have been, a cut in the so-called implicit ties with the government, I think that would have been a better solution. The items that were discussed earlier, the work that Citibank and McKinsey did was in part to evaluate that course. In my experience, there was never any genuine interest on the part of the government in pursuing that or allowing that to happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Hennessy.
Mr. Chairman, can I have
yes.
30 seconds prior to moving to the Commissioner? My understanding, Mr. Levin, was in your response to the question asked by Commissioner Fitzholz-Eakin that it was Thompson that asked the question. It was above your pay grade?
That was sloppy language. Let me.
No, it wasn't sloppy. It was quite clear. My understanding is between 2000 and 2008, you made $45 million. So only people above $45 million between 2 and 2008 could answer that question.
What I meant by what I was addressing was the question of could we affected the Charter Act.
Right, and
of
it
the
was above your
company.
pay grade.
Yes, and my language was sloppy.
No, it wasn't sloppy.
And what I meant
It
by
was
that,
flippant, if you want that as a choice.
what I meant by that, sir, was that that was in the purview of the Congress, not the company.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I'll get to those questions in a minute.
Mr. Hennessy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mudd, in your testimony you said, let me quote here, "I believe that in retrospect there was overinvestment in housing, origination standards slipped, there was too little skin in the game, home ownership rates probably rose too high." I agree with that assessment, and I want to better understand your view about whether Fannie's actions contributed to each of these four outcomes. My personal view is I believe that policymakers on both sides of the aisle contributed to each of these four problems. And I'd like to ask about the contribution of your decision to guarantee roughly $350 billion of Alt-A mortgages. So let me go through each of the four quickly in turn. You said there was an overinvestment in housing, but Fannie is not just a market follower. When Fannie takes an action, they become a market leader just because of their size. Do you think that your decision to increase participation in the Alt-A market caused this market to expand further? Did Fannie's guarantees contribute to overinvestment in Alt-A mortgages?
I think Fannie Mae's investments at large, given that it was in the chartered purpose of increasing home ownership and increasing affordable housing, did both of those things. It increased home ownership and it increased affordable housing, and therefore made the pie bigger, and therefore when the collapse came, more people were exposed to the collapse.
Okay, and then you said that origination standards slipped. Now, I understand your point that you had lower default rates than your competitors, but did Fannie's origination standards slip on Alt-A mortgages?
We tried to be very prudent and procedural in the process, and you've already mentioned the point about the comparison to the market at large. I think that in retrospect, there were kind of three factors around the Alt-A mortgages that probably deserve greater examination, although it's data that I don't have access to anymore, where the state concentrations in Alt-A tended to be the states with the least affordable housing. The states with the least affordable housing also happened to be among the biggest states, California and Florida among them, one. And that two, a proportion of that business, a high proportion of Alt-A business came through broker channels, and I think the broker channel by and large allowed a lot of leakage into the system of loans that were not underwritten to a higher quality. So that was what I had in mind there. We charged higher fees. We charged adverse market overrides on the Alt-A book, but because of its vintage being as close as it was to the collapse in home prices, those also tended to be the first ones to get hurt.
I think what I'm hearing from you there is, yes, the standard slipped, but you did your best to manage it. Is that fair? Or maybe it slipped, but it wasn't intentional, and you did your best to manage it.
I think that's a fair statement, that it was not our intention to slip it, but that in fact it was our intention to tighten the standards around Alt-A, and in fact they were tighter, as you pointed out, than the private market at large. But if you go back and look at it in retrospect, they weren't tight enough.
Okay. You said that there was too little skin in the game. Did Fannie lower its down payment requirements for subprime and Alt-A mortgages? Not directly in the way that you're describing. The participation in those markets, there were credit grids that had a multiplicity of factors on them that sort of sum total down to a number about whether a loan would be approved or not approved in the Fannie Mae system. So to the extent that a LTV ratio was higher,
somewhere else in the underwriting there would have to be a compensating factor that would move those up.
I got it. Let me try then. Let me rephrase it a little bit. Did Fannie Mae understand that they were guaranteeing mortgages that had higher LTV ratios and lower down payments?
Yes.
Okay. And then you said that homeownership rates probably rose too high. Do you think that Fannie Mae's increased participation in subprime and Alt-A markets contributed to these homeownership rates rising too high?
Contributed, I would say so.
Okay. Next, in your testimony, different topic here, you said a monoline GSE structure asked to perform multiple tasks cannot withstand a multi-year 30% home price decline on a national scale, even without the accompanying global financial turmoil. And you've mentioned several times that because you were a monoline firm, because you couldn't diversify, that was a significant contribution to the firm's failure. It seems to me that the key phrase there is asked to perform multiple tasks, because a monoline firm can survive a severe shock if it does an excellent job at risk management and if it is sufficiently well capitalized. Yes?
Yes, I thought about those words carefully, and you've interpreted them correctly.
Okay. So it's not, I am concerned, you seem to be ranking lack of diversity high in the reason for failure, and maybe I'm just reading something that's implicit, but it seems to me that having these extremely high leverage ratios and the inability to manage the risks was probably more important to the firm failing than the lack of diversification. Would you agree?
Well, the lack of diversification left the GSEs exclusively exposed to the one market that cratered the worst. So respectfully, I don't know how I can distinguish the two factors from each other. I'd be happy to try.
Okay. And then if I could, I just want to follow up on Mr. Georgiou's line of question, because what you said about not being aware of the firm trying to lobby Congress on the appropriation for the regulator just completely contradicts my experience over the past probably 10 years. And Mr. Chairman, I would just suggest that it's an important area for us to understand, because we've heard several times that Fannie Mae was in compliance with the regulatory capital standards. But if Fannie or its proxies were at the same time trying to keep those capital standards from being raised to something more like what a national bank or another large financial institution would have used, then there's a problem. I remember back to political science class, we learned about iron triangles, right, between a regulated firm, the Congress, and the regulator. And I just think we need to understand, now that the taxpayers in effect own these firms, to what extent were these firms trying to influence both legislative and executive branch policymakers to not just keep the funding for the regulator low, but to prevent stricter capital standards and to prevent the regulator from having stronger authority over the size of the portfolios.
Right. We'll note that for the record, and also instruction to staff. And I know they've already provided some information on lobbying expenses, which I think were cited by Mr. Georgiou as accumulating to $80 million over the time frame referenced.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy. Ms. Bourne.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for being willing to appear before us and help us with our work. In the written testimony of James Lockhart, who was the director of OFEO from 2006 and 2008, and who's going to appear before us this afternoon, he said that Fannie and Freddie had very large derivatives positions in connection with their portfolios of mortgage interests. And I understand from our staff that Fannie held about $1.2 trillion in notional amount of derivatives in the summer of 2008 prior to the conservatorship, and that Freddie had an additional $1.6 trillion in notional amount of derivatives. If you can if you have knowledge of this, could you tell us what kinds of derivatives were being held by Fannie Mae?
They were principally in the form of options, swaps, and swaptions thereon, plain vanilla, used for the purpose of extending the match on the debt to the underlying mortgage assets.
So they were basically being used for hedging purposes?
Yes.
And they were trying to hedge the interest rates risk that you had. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. The feature of the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is that the individual consumer can pay it off anytime they want to. And ideally, you would match 30-year funding to a 30-year asset. But because of that option, you had to understand what the likely actuarial statistical life of the book of the mortgages was going to be, and therefore it was generally most efficient to fund components of the portfolio with short-term paper or bullet debt or other forms of straight debt, and then use the derivatives market in order to create the optionality to match the term of the mortgage, and then to adjust that book depending on if interest rates were going up and the book was extending, or interest rates were coming down and the book was paying off.
So it was both interest rate risk and prepayment risk?
Yes, ma'am, which were derived of the same root cause.
Right. Did you also hedge against default risk in the portfolios?
Not in the form of derivatives. We would purchase credit enhancement in the form of mortgage insurance was the way we would do it.
Did you engage in any kind of speculation with derivatives trading?
No, it was, to my knowledge, it was all in the book, not for speculative purposes.
Mr. Lockhart suggested that there were concerns during the time he was the director of OFEO about the derivatives position with respect to Fannie Mae's and Freddie Mac's exposure to counterparty risk, and also, he said, interest rate risk. Can you explain what those concerns were?
I can explain how I thought about them from the standpoint of counterparty risk. I'm not sure. I was not able to read Mr. Lockhart's testimony. But as a general matter, as I suspect you know, the risk on the derivatives book is the failure of one of the counterparties to perform. So within the risk management function, we built out a team that was focused on counterparty risk and aggregate exposure with limits to each of those counterparties. And we actually, in the case of Fannie Mae, had to look at it across the book, because it would have been possible for us to have an exposure on the derivative side, on the debt side, and as well as the institution could have been a customer of ours on the credit side of the business. So that function was created to enable us to look across an entire counterparty and understand what the exposure was there. And that actually, I think, enabled us to reduce exposure in both the Bear Stearns and the Lehman situations in advance. So it proved fortuitous.
Did you experience any defaults in connection with Bear or Lehman or otherwise during, say, 2007 or 2008 on the derivatives portfolio positions?
I don't know. I don't have access to the place.
The Wall Street Journal on Tuesday, April 6, reported that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac currently have more than $2 trillion in notional amount of interest rate swaps on their books, and they are thereby among the largest participants in that market. And evidently, the Federal Housing Finance Agency is considering requiring that all those instruments be centrally cleared through a clearinghouse in order to diminish counterparty risk and also to obtain improved pricing information. Would you have considered that a good move while you were at Fannie Mae?
Hard to reposition myself in the past, but I think my concern would have been that that putting limitations on the markets where Fannie and Freddie could hedge that didn't, as very large users of derivatives, would put them in a different position with respect to the rest of the market, and that could either advantage others at the expense of Fannie and Freddie, or it could disadvantage Fannie and Freddie at the expense of not having as wide a palette of tools to use. My observation of reading the article was that as I noted in my testimony, the companies are being used in some ways to effectuate changes in public policies and public markets, and so there may be other reasons to do that that I'm not aware of anymore.
Mr. Levin, do you have a reaction?
I would be interested in the proposal. I've not seen the proposal, but it's difficult without seeing it to respond.
Let me just follow up a little bit on some questioning that you've had from Commissioner Giorgio and Hennessy about the political power and influence that Fannie Mae exercised prior to the conservatorship. Fannie Mae certainly had a reputation of exercising very significant political power in Washington through both extensive lobbying and government relations expenditures, and also hiring or retaining high former government officials to conduct its government relations and lobbying. Does it seem unusual to you that millions of dollars were being spent each year during the time you were CEO for lobbying expenses?
No, it does not.
Why not?
In premise, I would agree that there was a time when there were too many of the behaviors or activities that you described. So this was.
When was that?
Prior to my time as CEO, certainly. And one of the things that was on my list upon accession to the job was to get that right. And my thought was that, but at the same time, there were a number of complicated issues that went fundamentally to the existence of the companies before Congress. And secondly, there were inbound calls from Congress and other branches of the government that had to be responded to, and they had to be responded by somebody that understood what the lobbying rules and the interaction rules with government are, and those people happen to be called lobbyists. My determination was that the thing to do was to bring them inside the company, so they were under my direct supervision, but they also understood what the company was doing, and instead of, schmoozing, they were actually working on the issues of the day. But with the regulatory bill, which changed, I hoped, the fundamental nature under which the company was going to operate, I thought, and I still think to this moment, that it was very important to get that exactly right, and for us not to be on the field having our voice heard in terms of this provision will have this specific impact on what the company can and can't do, how we do and don't run the company, what our effect on the capital markets will and won't be. Didn't seem like the appropriate way to do it. Last sentence on that is that, as you may know, the lobbying numbers are derived as a headcount percentage multiplied by the overall expenses of the firm, And during the period, we were going through an expensive restatement, which made that denominator higher than it would have been in the ordinary course. So the numbers, excuse me, have to be used with some degree of caution.
Right. Ms. Bourne, do you need any more time on this matter?
I'd like to ask one more question.
All right,
on
2 minutes?
That would be fine.
Okay, yes.
I just wanted to ask whether Fannie Mae had a PAC that its officials would contribute to and that would be used to make contributions to public officials.
Yes.
And what was the name of the PAC?
Fannie PAC or something like that.
Do you have any recollection of how large that PAC was, how large the contributions to it were?
I don't. I know it's a matter of public record, I think.
I'm sure it is, and the
but I
staff
don't
will find it. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Hennessy, I'm going to move back to you because you did have 1 minute 50 seconds, but we're going to give you 2 minutes because of our generosity with time. You had another question.
You are too kind, Mr. Chairman.
I know. Don't forget it, though.
I certainly won't. Frankly, I'm just stunned by these comments because as a White House official over the past decade, I was directly lobbied by outside consultants who told me they were hired by Fannie and who told me that, in fact, Fannie had gone through the White House staff who they thought were working on the issue and targeted a specific lobbyist at each one of those staff. So my experience is just different than what you're describing. My question, you talked a lot about the balance between your fiduciary responsibilities to your shareholders and the need to fulfill your public purpose. And in your testimony, you said without earnings, the GSEs would not have been able to attract capital, to post reserves, to finance affordable housing projects, or to perform the function of channeling global capital flows into U.S. home ownership. So earnings are key to both those private goals and those public goals. And I'm confused about the public purpose of buying and guaranteeing about $350 billion of Alt-A mortgages. Was there a direct benefit to the housing market from these guarantees, or was it indirect through higher profits for the firm?
I think both.
And what was the direct benefit?
The direct benefit is that there were, as Mr. Levin mentioned earlier, there were loans in the Alt-A category that were obviously conventional conforming loans, but for want of some traditional part of the non-Alt-A loan underwriting. Just to pick an example, at one point we looked at providing loans to teachers. A loan to teachers wouldn't have 12 monthly amortizing payments. Could they have 9 months of payments and then three months of non-payment when the teacher's not working? Now, you might or might not agree that would be a laudable purpose, but in either case, that would be an Alt-A loan. So that's just an illustration of my thinking in terms of how Alt-A could serve the mission as well as the financial side of the business.
Thank you.
Mr. Giorgio, you had something you wanted to place on the record before we go to the Vice Chair. Microphone, please.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to finish up briefly on the list of what I would regard as potential accounting improprieties. The FHFA and OCC noted that Fannie did not recognize losses until a loan had been delinquent 24 months, and that Fannie made unsecured loans to delinquent borrowers. OCC noted in their report that allowance methodologies must be revised to recognize inherent loss in their portfolios regardless of the timing of the loss event, and it was critical given the extremely liberal attitude with respect to loss recognition and compounded by significant business initiatives undertaken by the GSEs to defer losses. There are three areas, and I guess I just stated for the record, and maybe you could respond in writing thereafter. Did Fannie make unsecured loans to delinquent borrowers under the Home Saver Advance program or any other program? Were the underlying loans thereafter no longer reported as delinquent loans? And did Fannie make those unsecured loans so it would not have to repurchase the underlying loans and record mark-to-market charges?
All right.
Thank you very much.
And we're going to ask you for written responses to those questions, right, gentlemen?
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Wallison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few minor matters, I think. Just for those who are watching on 2 minutes. Those who are watching on television, it would be important for you, if you want, to take a look at our website, where there is a staff report on Fannie and Freddie. And on page 8 of that report, there is a chart which shows Fannie and Freddie's compliance with the affordable housing guidelines and how that rises just above the requirements that HUD was imposing as it went on. So it'd be useful to see how influential those guidelines were in Fannie's purchase of subprime and Alt-A loans. A question came up about whether Alt-A loans are in fact goals rich, and there is some information on that. In 2000, HUD adopted a rule which said as they described their rule, new provisions clarify certain other provisions of HUD's rules for counting different types of mortgage purchases toward goals, including provisions regarding the use of bonus points for mortgages that are secured by certain single-family rental properties. That's why an Alt-A loan would be a goals-rich loan, because it allowed a non-owned investment to be rented, and a rental property did provide housing for the groups that were supposed to be included within the affordable housing loan. So that explains it, and we do have some information that was turned over by Freddie Mac, that on balance, they say, Alt-A loans were net positive for the housing goals. And finally, I want to talk about this question of private label securities, which in fact Fannie and Freddie did purchase in substantial numbers. This was a significant element of their purchases, and they were profitable because these were high-interest loans, unlike many of the loans that Fannie had made, and they were not as good quality. They were not as good quality as the loans that Fannie was making. So when you made the point, Mr. Mudd, that your loans were performing better than other loans, this was exactly right. Those subprime loans that underlay the private label securities were much worse in terms of their quality and have a much higher delinquency rate. And the odd part is that...
Mr. Walson, if you could just wrap up, we're over time.
I will. And the odd part is that in buying these pools, you were, in fact, advancing your competition's position, because they would assemble these pools of conforming loans and sell them to you, and they helped you with your affordable housing guidelines. They were also profitable, but it also helped Wall Street do more of the securitization that they were doing. Thank you.
We'll leave that, and if you would like to respond, we'll ask you to do that in writing. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Much of the questioning that we've heard today is based on the fact that you obviously were dealing in quote-unquote investments which look a lot like some of the other folk who were in front of us in dealing in investments, unfortunately with much the same outcome. But in fact, you folks really aren't a business at all. I mean, when Ms. Murren asked you about compensation and the companies that you compared yourself with, those really are companies. They have articles of incorporation, a lot of them in Delaware because of their rules. They basically have to make a profit. If they don't make a profit at some point, they cease to exist. But you didn't have to have articles of incorporation, and you didn't have to make a profit. So in any of those discussions, I'm going to spend a little time to bring it back into what I would probably say more so than any other commissioner, my world. For more than 3 decades, I've been in Washington. People look at Washington, D.C. as a national capital, international capital. But Tom Brokaw in his book talked about Washington, D.C. really being a small town. And in the time that I've been here, I can tell you that in spades, it's also a company town. I'm looking at a 2002 paper put out by Fannie Mae under the heading Fannie Mae Papers. Headline title, Implications of the New Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac Risk-Based Capital Standard. Again, this is 02. It says down in the corner, Fannie Mae Papers is an occasional series on policy issues of interest to the housing community. And the conclusion of the paper, and not unsurprising, or probably wouldn't have seen the light of day, this analysis shows that, quote, based on historical data, the probability of a shock as severe as embodied in the risk-based capital standard is substantially less than 1 in 500,000 and may be smaller than 1 in 3 million. Given the low probability of the stress test shock occurring, and assuming that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac hold sufficient capital to withstand that shock, the exposure of the government to the risk that the GSEs will become insolvent appears quite low. Commissioner Hennessy talked to you about the fact that as there was an attempt to get Fannie Mae to increase its capital levels, there was resistance from Fannie Mae, yet this document, based upon that assumption, was put out, I assume, to try to attract business under your concept of your business model, but probably as important as the content of this is who wrote it. There are 3 names on here. The one that I was drawn to was a fellow by the name of Peter R. Orzag, who's currently the director of the Office of Management and the Budget. I want to talk about small town, company town. Franklin Raines was Fannie Mae's vice chairman from 1991 to 1996. In 1996, he moved directly from Fannie Mae to be the director of the Office of Management and the Budget from 96 to 98. When he left the director of the Office of Management and the Budget, he became CEO at Fannie Mae, 1999 to 04. In my more than 30 years, I don't recall, because in yesterday's panel, former comptroller of the currency, Mr. Hawk, talked about the advantage of going in and out of government and the cross-fertilization and the benefit. And I agree with that, with certain limitations, but I have never seen the in and out of government revolving door quite so focused on a position of significant importance in an administration from your quote-unquote business back to your quote-unquote business. I look at lobbying slightly differently than I think most people here. You said that you wanted to make sure that you had people on the field. I think you and I both know it's a whole lot better if you have people in the locker room. And I think there's just overwhelming evidence. When you look at those people that were employed for lobbying, once again, I probably read this book differently than others. I'm shocked at the virtual 100% content of the profile of the lobbying firms. They're either former members of Congress, members of Congress to be, or spouses of members of Congress, or, depending on who's in control, a significant staffer who had been with the majority, if Democrats were in the majority, or with the Republicans, if they were in the majority, or back again. I mean, it is a clear indication that notwithstanding their knowledge, there may have been a secondary reason, and maybe the knowledge might have been secondary, as to why these people were employed, in my opinion. Commissioner Bourne asked you about the involvement in the political process, political action committees. I'm a little more interested in a slightly different way, because you really have as a kind of a board of directors based upon your origin, that is by statute, that's why you didn't have to incorporate, and that the money that is your lifeblood in terms of structure and movement is actually appropriated by Congress. And over my 30 years, I got to know, I never wanted to be on the Appropriations Committee, but I got to know those who were. And I think it would be fair to say that given the size of the Appropriation Committee, it breaks up into subcommittees that look at specific areas of the federal government that need the appropriations from those specific areas, both in the House and the Senate. And they take a very proprietary attitude toward those areas. They're theirs. You mentioned Senator Kemp Bond was mentioned, senator from Missouri, as at that time chairman of the VA Approps Subcommittee, ranking member Senator Mikulski from Maryland. It's true in the House as well, and we'll hear some testimony with the panel following yours to reflect more on those particular activities. I just want to ask a simple question of you about what went on behind closed doors. Mr. Levin, you were there longer than Mr. Mudd. Were you ever present at a meeting in which there was a discussion about how a particular member of Congress might be approached in attempting to advance the quote-unquote business model of Fannie Mae?
My recollection stems from the days that I ran the Housing and Community Development Organization in Fannie Mae, which was the organization that made...
I've got very little time. Really, a yes or no would be sufficient, because you can follow it up with comments to elaborate.
I'll be short. We made a big effort to try to do important things in communities.
I'll try it again. Yes or no?
And we made a...
Mr. Chairman?
I was going to say, Mr. Levin, can you answer the question? It was a pretty straightforward question.
I just lost a minute of time.
Well,
I don't have a lot of time because I conceded it to others.
Yeah, I'll give it back. I think it's a pretty straightforward question, Mr.
Yes.
Levin, about whether you were in a meeting or not in which the subject of approaching a member of Congress was raised with respect to advancing the interests of Fannie Mae. I think that's a fair characterization. I think a yes or no would be appropriate.
5 words. We wanted members of Congress to be aware of the good work we were doing in the community.
No, come on, yes or no?
Yeah.
The answer is yes, right?
Please answer the question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Bond? Yes. It's not that hard. See, once you get into the rhythm, it's easier. Did you ever attend an event which was classified as a political event for a then-sitting member of Congress in either the House or the Senate?
I don't recall if I ever did.
You don't recall if you ever did. They were pretty boring, so you wouldn't have remembered going to an event for a particular member of Congress. Mr. Mudd? Yes. You did. So that's what I mean by not having to worry about who's on the field if you have access to the locker room. I don't know why people focus on paying for lobbyists. So I guess what I'm trying to point out to you is, in reference to Commissioner Bourne's statement, there were a lot of people, including myself, who were well aware of the intimate access by Fannie Mae, both through your Political Action Commission and direct involvement, that was designed to a very great extent to promote your quote-unquote business model. In testimony that we're going to hear very briefly in reference to Commissioner Mullins' question, there's a quote, and it's attributed to Fannie Mae's internal auditor, focused on the last decade, in the effort to double earnings in 5 years to 6.46, and I assume that's billion. The quote is, "By now you must have 646 branded in your brains. You must be able to say it in your sleep. You must be able to recite it forwards and backwards. You must have a raging fire in the belly that burns away all doubts. You must live, breathe, and dream 646. You must be obsessed on 646. After all, thanks to Frank, we all have a lot of money riding on it." There was a book and a movie, and it occurred when I was relatively young and had a big impression on me. It was called Bridge Over the River Kwai. In terms of someone so enthusiastically involved in their work that at the aha moment, it was, what have I done? In terms of building a really good bridge to help the Japanese move their supplies in Southeast Asia during World War II. The idea that you would ask someone here, how much would you give to make sure that government had its program tweaked toward home ownership? Come on. How much would you give back to help the taxpayers with their burden left by the way in which you and your cohorts ran this particular quote, unquote, company? Because I think you lost your way to a certain extent. It was, more than it ever should have been, focused on the amount of money that you folks could earn. And I'm just amazed, Mr. Levin, if the kind of decisions that ran the company in the ground were above the $45 million mark, which was your pay grade. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I have some just very quick concluding questions, and they're really clarifications, so very brief answers. And then I have one question for you, Mr. Mudd, in conclusion. When you talk about mission, I just want to be clear that obviously there's the business, the profit mission, and I mentioned the affordable housing goals. Would liquidity be included in mission? Liquidity for the housing market? Okay, just for the record.
Yes.
All right. Again, for the record, as I understood the interchange with you and Mr. Wallison, and I think I'm characterizing that all lines of business were pursued with an eye towards making money, but there may have been differential profit goals for those various lines of business. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, so, all right, just want to be clear, but there were no businesses in which you deliberately engaged with the idea, even though obviously it turned out such, but in which you engaged or underwrote them, in which you would do cross-subsidization to the extent of loss in a particular business unit.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Mr. Thomas.
Mr. Chairman, I want to clarify. In the quote that talked about what was burning in their belly, that 646, it was a goal of earnings per share, which really brings it home.
Thank you. It's too long a question. All right. Here are my final two comments or questions. In 2007, you bought, as the market's beginning to crash, really, you bought $21 billion of private label securities in that year when most of the markets were trenching pretty dramatically. I'm just going to ask you, was there any pressure brought on you to do that by folks, for example, in political positions and without regard to party, administration, or Congress to support Wall Street? Saying you guys got to move in and continue to buy PLS? Or in 2007, were you buying private label securities because you still thought they were a reasonable bet? I mean, did anyone ever come to you and say, look, Wall Street's, in 2007, things are beginning to, they're pulling out of the market. A lot of the firms on Wall Street have very significant private label securities. We want you to help offload some of that. Did that ever occur?
No one ever said that to me.
Same.
Okay, good. Final question, and that is that March 19th, there's a press release, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, OFEO. in which you've had your portfolio limits lifted, you've had your capital surplus reduced, and you commit to raise some more capital. Why on God's earth, in 2008, would you be positioning yourselves to do more in the market as a straight business enterprise?
The capital override that the regulator had in place at that time was set up as a hard line. And with the volatility in the markets, we had a concern that on account of nothing that we did but external market volatility, we could go under the capital line and therefore be in technical violation. So our ask was to give some flexibility around that line on the capital requirements, but to ameliorate the logical concerns that would come out of that by expressing our interest to maintain those levels of capital, if not raise capital. We thought at that point in the market, with ARMs resetting, subprime loans not being financeable, that there was some good that we could do by helping to finance borrowers coming out of those loans who otherwise would have qualified for a conventional conforming type loan.
All right. My question was March of 2008, though. Is that what you're referring to in the response?
The discussion went on before that and after that, but that's...
But you had sought also to lift your portfolio cap so you could do more, correct? Or was that something that was suggested to you?
We had taken the portfolio down below where it was actually required to be. Because
so why were the portfolio caps lifted?
That would be a topic you'd have to talk about with the regulator, but I think the general concern...
You didn't ask for it?
I think that we were in favor of doing it because it gave us more flexibility.
All right. Because it just seems odd to me that as the markets, most businesses, picking up on Mr. Thomas's comment, most business enterprises are looking at a market in which values are decreasing, risk is increasing, and what Fannie Mae is doing and announcing with OFEO and Freddie, concerted action is these two business enterprises are increasing their portfolio caps, i.e. the ability to do more business and lowering capital. And so I'm just trying to understand why it happened.
I think at least a component of it was that it was seen as an indication that there would be those liquidity crisis, right? So there would be some expectation that there would be liquidity available in the marketplace, but it did not imply that we were going to do anything that was outside prudent standards with that liquidity. When everybody else left, the spreads widened up and made that more attractive.
Well, we can visit this. I don't want to take any more time. The regulator will be here, and obviously the regulator was very involved in that transaction, and so we can explore that more. We may have some written questions for you to fully understand exactly what happened, why, and who were the parties engaged in those discussions. Okay, Commissioners, thank you very much, Mr. Levin. Thank you very much, Mr. Mudd. We will break, Commissioners, till 12:25. Thank you.